When you talk about overuse injuries, it's so common in the sport. Do you think that's something where the coach needs to step in when they see someone like a young Tim Gable doing 80 quads a week? Is that something where Carol should have stepped in and said, "Hey," or would you have not listened to her?
I think, well, of course I would not have listened.
Yeah.
I was 14 and I was like, I can do this and no one else can, so I'm going to do whatever I want. Um, I was a treat to teach in my younger teenage years, let me tell you. Poor Carol. I don't know how I didn't age her 25 years. Um, but
She looks
really, I
great.
think I think the key is the coaches know a lot better now. When we first started doing quads, like I've even talked to like Mishin and Yagudin about this. Like we didn't know it. You can go and you can do 15 or 20 triple flips a day, and like yeah, you might get shin splints, you might get tendonitis, but you're not going to have like joint musculoskeletal issues. I think for girls, I think the triple triples, and I think for the guys, triple axles and quads, it's just a different ball game, and it is more impact, and there's a lot more torque. And when we first started doing the quads, it was sort of experimental. It was just like, hey, just kind of chuck yourself up into the air. Like we were all at first trying to like, jump higher or like jump more like straight up and down, where really it's just a matter of getting into the rotation sooner. Like we know that
Snapping
now.
it, yeah.
Yeah.
Did you
Um,
use a harness to learn, or pads, or any of that?
I I didn't a little bit for triple axle, like the normal on the track harness, but like I'm old. We didn't have fishing pole harnesses when I was learning those things.
Just
And
kamikaze style.
it
Throw
was,
yourself
and
in the
like
air.
maybe one of those butt pad things. If you had like a big black and blue black and blue mark on your hip or whatever from like slapping onto the left side,
Yeah.
which those are always a treat. But no, we didn't do that, and it was like we kind of, especially at Winterhurst, kind of like looked down on them. We're like, suck it up and
Mhm.
take the hit or don't. But now, yes, I think coaches need to be much more diligent about limiting the number of repetitions on on the harder stuff. And I think it's like focusing more on like perfecting the takeoff on the triple, making sure every takeoff is the same, doing exercises like throwing in some drills and stuff, because you can't go out, even if you do 10 quad attempts, when you're learning it, it's like do three, go back, do a good double, do a good
Mhm.
triple, like check the takeoff, make sure the timing's right, make sure for the toe jump, especially make sure that the tap is going in and you're not like torquing the ankle and rolling out. So yeah, I think it's that, but I also think more people don't spend enough time doing off ice. And like when I competed my best, I was spending as much time training off ice as I was training on ice. So it was, warming up beforehand, stretching after I got off the ice, going to Pilates, going to the gym, doing cardio and lifting. And I think it's very easy to get consumed in like, oh, I need to get a triple jump, so I need to do a lot of triple jumps. Well, yes, you need to do a lot of triple jumps, but you also need to be flexible enough and balanced enough, because we get so lopsided, like I actually could see a visible difference in my quads at the end of the season, and my right quad was bigger than my left because from doing all the combinations with triple loops as a second jump, because it takes a lot more, pop. So I think there needs to be much more focus. Most of the high level coaches have sort of really been diligent in incorporating that. But I think it just really needs to be emphasized, especially for the younger kids. Obviously, we're not going to have 10-year-olds on the squat machine, putting a couple 100 pounds on them, but like they need to be doing something. They need to be doing some light plyos and making sure that they're not completely lopsided, because I think that
That's a big thing.
can probably be more damaging than necessarily the repetition is, when you're completely like not symmetrical.
Hmm.
One thing that we wanted to ask about was peaking in terms of a career. I think in 2010 we saw Evan Lysacek really look almost like this was the best his body was ever going to look. He was, delivering at such a level consistently, speed wise. And in 2003 at the World Championships, your body just looked like you were on. The performance was great. So, did you ever feel like, did you know when it was your peak, when you were at your best, or did you still feel like you could push your body more? Because you did continue on for seasons after that.
You never realize it's your peak until you start to slide. Because you don't, like my, even coming out of 2003 Worlds, it was like, I assumed that if my body, like, assuming that I stayed healthy, I expected to get better.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, my body was already starting to fall apart, and I never really got the pieces put back together. So I never, after 2003, never felt like I was healthy enough to train appropriately to get better. Like there was no, it was barely like, kind of scraping to hold on and like to not lose things. Whereas by 2006, I had lost everything. Like I was able to land a quad toe here and there, like definitely more so at a nationals practice than any time in the 6 months prior to that. But I just like there was no quad sow, like doing triple triples hurt. And I didn't feel weak. I just felt like I couldn't push myself hard enough to be good anymore. But again, like you don't know at the time, especially when you're what, 22, 23. I was like I just assumed that I would get stronger and I would get better, and because mentally I was so much more disciplined at that point, I was like, I've learned all these things, now all I need to do is apply them and I will just continue to get better.
One of the things you talked about during that period in your career was you had a bunch of boot problems and equipment problems. What role does equipment play? Because I think people don't understand when one thing is off in your boot or your blade as a skater, it can throw a whole season off, and it can just be so frustrating because it's something that's out of your control. Was that something that really came into play during that time, as you spoke of?
It definitely played into the injuries. People don't understand, like having your blade set off by a millimeter in the front or in the back in the wrong direction. Every slight little difference, you start to compensate. As an athlete, like when something feels off, if you have really good muscle memory, which I did, I was good technically, but I was much more of a feeling skater.
Mm-hmm.
So if things didn't feel normal, like I would just kind of naturally, my body would adapt until I was like where I kind of felt like I needed to be. And I'm sure you felt the same thing. You can adapt a little bit and adapt a little bit more and adapt a little bit more, but after a certain point, there's no more moving parts to adapt, and that's when the injuries come in. And it's so subtle, and you don't feel it at the time. You absolutely don't. And again, we're talking about like hairline things being a little bit off. The boot problems that I was having was within the actual sole of the boot. I forget what it's called. I think it's called the stanchion. Like basically the support inside the leather soles. They were a little bit twisted, so my foot was never truly sitting flat in the boot. And it was off just enough that like I was compensating and I was adjusting, and then I was, moving the blade 55 times because nothing felt normal. Like I would go to the boot guy upstairs at Hell South, and I'm like, it's not right, but I don't know what to tell you. It's just, it doesn't feel right. And it's like, I'm like, it's not that, after a while I was like, it can't be the setting. Like I've done everything except put the blade on backwards. Like,
So
there's
frustrating too.
Exactly. And then it starts to play into your head because then you start to think maybe it is me. Maybe I can't do these things anymore. And, after dealing with that from September until February, March, like right before tour, I switched to Klingbeil. He looked at my feet, fixed my feet, and then from that point on, I was like, oh, I actually can do this stuff again. Isn't this novel? I can actually do the jumps that I'm capable of doing. But I think, it becomes very easy to dismiss, especially the people that have been around and like are, quote unquote, having a bad season when they've been really great in the past. I think it's very easy to dismiss a boot issue as, a training issue or a health issue or, maybe they're just not as good as they used to be. But it's completely underestimated how much of an impact it has. both because there's a physical component where you actually are changing technique and you are adapting to something that's not correct. It's not even necessarily that it's like the booter blade is wrong, but it's like it's not right for you. It's not working for that athlete at that time. But there's the physical component and then there's the whole mental component because once you start to doubt, going out in competition is just like a horror show. Like, I don't know, I'm sure you've had competitions where you haven't necessarily felt on your game. And you go out there for a long program, like you can survive a short. But you go out there for a long program and you're like, this could be so bad it's like beyond words. And once in a while it was. And you're like, when you go out with that like pit in your stomach, like I remember at Cup of China one year, it was right after I had had all the boot issues and the whatever, and I wasn't necessarily skating that well. And I remember during my long looking up at the clock and being like, holy crap, I have 2 minutes left. I felt like someone had run me over with a train. My legs were starting to like shake. And I'm like, I have to try to do another triple axel. I'm like, well, that's clearly not happening. Like, it just, when you're that stressed out and you have that doubt and you have that like panic thing set in, like no matter how well trained you are, like the legs go, you can't breathe, like
How
it's a terrible feeling.
how much during your programs were you thinking during them? Do you remember? Because I've talked to some skaters and they say they got off the ice and they don't remember anything. You just the complete blank the second they got out on the ice, and whereas other skaters say they like you talk about, you can step on the ice and just know you're going to skate really well or not really well. Are there really any memorable performances where you just remember skating really, really well and knowing it? And to that end, did you talk to yourself during a program? What was it usually like for you out there?